When Farmer James and his companion Ghost arrived to claim their inheritance, they were searching for a peaceful beginning. The road had given up trying to be a road a few miles back and become two stubborn ruts glistening with seep water and last night's rain, shouldered by goldenrod and ironweed. West Virginia had always lived at the edge of his maps, a place people said, "down in there," about with a gesture rather than a name. Now the coordinates in a lawyer's envelope had put him in it, past cell service, past any harvest schedule or auction date. He parked in a small clearing not much wider than the truck itself, and sat a moment with his hands around the wheel, feeling the engine shiver down. Ghost pressed a paw against his thigh, like he did on hard days, and James let out the breath he'd been saving since the courthouse in Fairmont, since the kind-eyed man with the thinning hair had read out the last will of a great-uncle he remembered as a name on Christmas cards and a pair of blue suspenders at a reunion. Silas Ward, the family said, was the one who had lit out. He had gone farther into the hills than the rest of them, traded town talk for tree talk, and apparently, without telling anyone, bought 300 acres of ridge and holler and creek bottom that the coal companies had overlooked or shrugged at, and then stayed there so long the place learned him. And then he died in his sleep, in a chair by a stove, no wife, no kids, no debts that the land could pay, and he left what he had to a nephew's boy who had always fixed what broke without cussing too loud, and who had stood too long at the edge of auction rings with his jaw set. "Ready?" James asked, not because Ghost could answer, but because saying it made him mean it. He opened the door. Damp leaf smell hit him, tannic and clean, the scent of a forest's breath, and underneath it a faint iron tang of exposed rock. The cabin was plain and right-looking from a distance, a rectangle of weathered logs chinked neat, a roof of corrugated metal darkened with age and maple shade, a stone chimney rising on the gable end like an old man's shoulder under a coat. There were details that told of careful hands, mesh over the soffit vents to keep embers out, gutters that pitched true toward rain barrels set on cinder blocks, a door built thick and banded with iron like it meant to hold. And there, stitched to the trees at the clearing's edge, stood a narrow watch structure, not the steel leggy kind you saw in service calendars, but a tall wooden shaft braced by cross members, with a small room at the top and a slit of window cut to look east and west. It made the hair lift at the back of James's neck, not from fear, but from recognition. Silas had made himself a high place to think from. Farmers and foresters did that with whatever they had: silos, windmills, hilltops. It was a habit of people who read horizon as text. The door key from the lawyer's envelope sat heavy and old-fashioned in his palm. He slid it into a mortise lock that turned like it had been oiled last week, and the door swung open on hinges that didn't complain. The air inside carried a soft mix of wood smoke ghost, machine oil, and the faint sweetness of wool. One large room, orderly, everything with a home. A bedstead made from peeled locust poles, a table planed smooth by elbows and time, 2 ladder-back chairs, a cast-iron cook stove with its pipe shouldered into the chimney, a hand pump at a deep porcelain sink that had crazy little crack lines in its glaze like ice on a stock tank. Near the door stood a set of pegs with a canvas coat and a felt hat. On a shelf, neatly labelled jars, screws, hinges, gasket rings, stood like a small hardware store. Beside them, a stack of notebooks bound with twine, each spine written on with a carpenter's pencil in tight block letters. Rain and wind. Creek heights, fire lines, tracks, nights. James touched the one that said nights and then did not open it yet. You didn't go straight to a man's midnight thoughts before saying hello to his morning ones. He worked the pump handle. It complained once, then took hold, and cold water surged into the sink, clear as a bell. He let it run till the smell of pipe went away, and cupped his hands, drank, splashed his face. Ghost circled the room, nose low, tail making a low heliograph of curiosity, and then sat by the door, head cocked at the seam of light like he had appointed himself doorman. James set the lawyer's envelope on the table and laid out the other things he had kept close since the reading: a small ring of keys in a little muslin sack, and a folded paper with a hand-drawn map that looked like a topo had been traced and then annotated by someone who loved names. Rock Pen, Black Hand Run, Deer Lick, Chuckwalla Switch. Silas had written in the kind of careful hand that hammered fence staples in straight and stacked wood so the bark edges alternated. There was a grace to precision he had always admired. He took Ghost to walk the clearing boundaries, because that was the first thing you did with ground that might be yours. Learn its edges. He noted how the boundary fence used chestnut rails in a few surviving sections and woven wire in others, how the corner posts were locust and sunk deep, the old way. He ran a palm over the rails and felt the worn smoothness where deer jumped and rubbed. The grass told him what the sun did at noon. The soil at the path's low point held a boot print older than last night's rain, wide and flat, with a tread patch like you saw on loggers' boots, and near it a shallow half-moon gouge with a smooth glossy face. He crouched and put a knuckle to it. Plastic. A skid of something heavy on plastic. He looked toward the trees and saw where mountain laurel leaves still carried a faint powder-like flour, dust shaken off under the weight of a thing passing. He said nothing, only filed it, the way he had filed harvest numbers and hay weights and water meter readings for years, the slow, quiet math of staying ahead. By late afternoon, he had the truck unloaded, the bed made, a kettle on, and a plan to sweep an inventory after dark, when work that kept you moving and close could do double duty as company. He carried in an armful of split oak from the neat stack under the porch eave and set it by the stove, appreciating how Silas had stacked with bark up on the top course and kept the row's nose and tail so they didn't lean. Outside, a thrush sang once and then again, far off, and a soft wind nudged the hemlocks. The quiet here was not the city's lack of space quiet. It was a quilt, layered and warm with small sounds, well patched. He opened the notebook marked rain and wind first because nobody lied to those pages. They were dates and numbers, arrows and totals, patient as fence posts. 5 years back, 7, 9. Storms logged with a man's worry for what rain might do to clay, what wind might do to fire. Then creek heights, simple notches of flood lines drawn in the margin, with dates, a pencil bar climbing as high as his thumb along a page labeled July, and then flattening and falling away. Fire lines had diagrams, little maps of raked ground and cut slash, and a note in the margin, duff deep near the old oak, scraped to mineral. He read tracks last before nights because it sat between them and might say what the man watched walking around what he loved: fox, coon, turkey, bear. The bear prints were big, the claw marks lightly sketched like he had drawn what he did not want to find too often. One page had a human soul drawn with measurements and a note he could hear in the pencil. Vibram lug. Not one of mine. Multiple passes. Night after rain. He closed it and set it down. When he finally opened nights, he did it like a gate you knew might be sprung. The first pages were simple. Moonrise times, owl calls, minor auroras sometimes, a meteor streak noted as bright as a welder arc. Then a change. Old logging road. Unlighted traffic at hours no man should haul timber if his brand was honest. 3 vehicles eastbound. Rear axle riding low, covered bed. Same night 1 week later, westbound empty. Parked in the cut at 1:30, no dome light when doors opened. The pencil had bitten deeper on those nights. The graphite looked shinier, like a crease in bark. He read on. There were dates where the truck counts grew, then slowed, then changed to longer wheelbases, to a notation winch sound, cable squeal, and a detail only a patient man would hear. Rubber on rock. Slow, careful, practiced. The last entry was months ago and ended mid-line. New faces at the edge of the clearing, south fence, hands on rails, low talk. Then the pencil had stopped. A coffee ring stained the bottom corner. Ghost huffed once, not quite a bark, and rose, nose pushed close to the lower edge of the door. James stood without thinking and stepped to one side of the window, the way you do when you want a view without offering one. The light outside had gone the color of iron, the first true fall evening of the year, cool from the hollers and heavy on the skin. He waited a long minute and heard nothing but a limb creak. Then he opened the door a crack and let Ghost slip out ahead and left, while he went right, low, not playing soldier, just playing careful. He rounded the corner of the cabin and saw nothing in the yard, but there, at the base of the watch structure, the dirt had been fretted. He knelt and found a hollow where paws had begun to worry the soil. Ghost had dug there, not deep, a start of a hole by the gnarled root of an old pine that leaned slightly into the tower's first brace. Ghost came back to him with dirt on his nose, tail wagging once in a small circle like he'd done a job. "What do you smell, buddy?" James asked, and he touched the ground where the dog had started, and there, just under the duff, his fingers found canvas. He widened it with his hands, lifting a square of oiled cloth that shed water like a duck's back, and beneath it a metal can, the size of a shoebox, olive green, latch crusted with rust like sugar. He worked the latch with the flat of his knife. It gave with a persuasion he would not have trusted to pliers. He opened the lid. The inside was dry and smelled faintly of gun oil and old rope. On a bed of folded burlap lay a few carefully chosen things. A brass disc the size of his palm, etched with stars and lines, not random, but not one of the big showpiece constellations he remembered. It was a map of this sky at a certain time, he realized, not the sky of city calendars, but the sky you could see from a ridge with your neck back. Next to it lay a key forged dark and heavy, its tip made in a shaped star that matched the disc's center figure, so tidily it made his scalp tingle. The joy of a fit, the rightness of a tool built for a lock. Under those, wrapped in rag, a small flashlight and 3 fat batteries in wax paper, and a folded topo map with notes in the same hand. The old tram grade along Laurel Fork, culverts, a switchback choked with rocks, a symbol he didn't know repeated 3 times. And on the underside of the lid, taped painstakingly, a note. "If you found this, you're the one I hoped would. Don't write down more than you must. See from high. They use the road like a blind creek, flows heavy one way, light the other. Don't try to be a hero. Be a witness. The law is slow, but it still likes a straight fence." James closed the lid and set the can on his thigh a moment, the weight a kind of anchor. He wasn't here to go to war with anyone. He was here because the land needed a pair of hands that would not take more than it gave, and because he needed a place that would let him hurt less loudly than a town did. But witness was something he could do. He folded the note back and tucked it in his shirt pocket above his heart. Then he slid the key and the disc into his pants pocket and stood, looking up at the tower. If there was a lock that fit that star, it would be up there. The ladder rungs were rough and honest and flexed with the weight of years. He tested each one and climbed, moving like a man who had carried children up hayloft ladders, careful of splinters and sound and the way a slip bruised later. The small room at the top was just big enough for a man and a stool and a view. Slits cut in 3 walls offered lines toward compass points, and a little shelf held a pair of binoculars heavier than any he'd used for birds. Along the east wall, carved into the wood with a pocket-knife's patience, was the same constellation that gleamed on the brass disc. The carving was careful work, deep where the stars were bigger, shallow where they weren't, with join lines etched thin. He held the disc up and turned it until the points matched, and in the center, where the brightest star sat, he saw a circle of wood that wasn't oak like the rest to his eye, but a darker plug with grain running a different way, and when he pressed it with his thumb, it slid back with a small woody sigh. From the face of the little chest that sat flush with the wall, he hadn't even noticed it in the dim light. Something moved, a panel no wider than his palm sliding aside to show a star-shaped hole. He swallowed and smiled despite himself. "All right, Uncle Silas," he said softly. "You made a thing." The key fit as if it had learned the lock's language long ago. He turned it gently. Somewhere under the floor, a series of clicks moved outward like a row of traps sprung in reverse, and the lid of the low chest rose a finger's width. He lifted it the rest of the way. Inside lay a neat row of items. A topo spread of the property and beyond, with red pencil lines along an old logging road that paralleled Black Hand Run, before veering to cross the ridge and drop into a cut marked Old Tipple. A small field notebook with nights and dates and vehicle counts. A used roll of trail camera cards labeled by month in a cigar tin. A handheld radio with a flexible antenna labeled with the volunteer fire frequency and the Monongahela Ranger District frequency, penciled on a strip of tape. A pair of night vision binoculars wrapped in flannel, and under a fitted panel that lifted with a finger grip, a bolt-action rifle with a scope, the wood dark with oil and honest use. He touched the stock and then pulled his hand back. He wasn't a stranger to a rifle. Coyotes had taught him enough. but he'd never loved them the way some men loved the sound of their names. Here, it was a tool of last resort. He took the radio and set it on the shelf. He took the binoculars, because it was foolish to watch at night with only your ears. He snapped the chest closed and removed the key. The light had thinned by the time he climbed down, a smear of gold on the far ridge and blue filling the gaps. He set a small supper of beans and skillet bread and apples he'd brought in a crate, and Ghost hovered politely till he was told to lie down. After he'd eaten and washed the tin plate with a rag and a little hot water, he sat by the table and turned the brass disc in his hand, watching the lamplight slide across it like a slow river. The last time he had owned land, he had watched shadows move over it from the seat of a tractor, clocked rain by the rim of a bucket, made deals with weather and markets, and lost, fair or not. This felt different. This was stewardship without asking anyone's permission to care. He blew out the lamp when the dark came good and stood at the window with the night vision pressed to his eyes. The world leaped forward in shades of green, brighter at the edges, crisp where motion made it so. He panned slowly, learning the curve of the clearing, the line of the fence, the stamp of his own truck sitting a little humble, as if it knew it was a visitor. He watched until the small ache in his shoulders said enough. He slept with Ghost on the floor beside the bed, and the radio on the stool, volume low. In the night, a sound woke him that wasn't wind or limb talk. Ghost was already up, body a tight line, his breath puffing once like a small engine starting. James slid his feet to the floor, hand on Ghost's shoulder, and listened. It came again, a low rhythmic thrum that might have been a generator far off, or tires slow on rock, a pulse with a patient mind. He didn't switch on the lamp. He crossed to the window and lifted the binoculars and felt the world pour into them. At the far edge of what the glass could make plain, a long pale line lay in the woods like a creek in drought. Not water, but roadbed, and on it shapes stepped slowly, almost no light. Whatever light there was, he realized, was uphill, thrown low from a tarp truck's open bed when the tarp kinked or lifted in the wind and then pressed down again. He saw men walking alongside, their bodies set with the caution of people who didn't love this work but were married to it for the night. He watched them pass a cut and pause, watched two peel off and slip into the trees, watched a third stay near the tailgate like a nurse stays near the drip. He did not think hero or gun. He thought dates, times, counts, routes. He found the radio with his hand and raised it, pressed the transmit and spoke as if he were calling in a field fire. Ranger Station, this is a private citizen on private land near Black Hand Run and Laurel Fork. Witnessing unlighted convoy traffic on old logging grade. Request to log activity over. Static hissed like rain, and then a voice came out thinning and thickening like a clothesline in wind. Citizen on Black Hand, we copy. Go ahead with logging. We're taking record. Are you in immediate danger? Over. James kept his voice level and quiet. Negative on immediate danger. I'm under roof and not impeding. I will observe and record. The voice came back, older, steady. Understood. If you can safely get license or counts, do so. Do not engage. Weather windows closing in 2 days. We're light on cruise. Over. Roger, he said, and let go the button and exhaled, and Ghost, as if permission had been granted, lowered himself between James and the wall and sighed, but kept his eyes open. He watched until the last truck dissolved into trees and left behind only the low echo of what it had been. He wrote down what he had seen in a schoolteacher's careful hand, because numbers were sacred when they told the truth. Then he slept, and in the morning, the world arrived clean, with a cloud hung low on the ridge and crows gossiping like old men. He got up and moved through chores that weren't chores yet, sweeping, stacking, testing the small Jenny in the shed and its exhaust line, checking the drip leg on the propane, priming the little pump by the sink, so it didn't lose its seal when the cold decided to show its teeth. He walked the south fence and found where the top strand had been pressed down by a boot, not hoof, and he wired a small bell to it, not to catch anyone, just to let the fence speak. He hung a grease-soaked burlap strip near the corner, and then went and saw whether any sleeve picked it up on the way by. These were small farmer tricks his grandfather had treated like secrets, the sort that never made it into the television shows. He set an old baby monitor he'd found in the cupboard on the porch, speaker inside, so the clearing could whisper to him when he closed his eyes. Toward noon, he drove the short spur he'd noticed on the map, and found it ended at a view that made his stomach do what it did when a hay wagon tipped too far downhill. The valley below was a green sleeve with a creek seam bright at the bottom, and across it a cut ran along contour like a scar. On that cut, parked in a little shouldered-out space, sat a pickup with mud up to its door handles, and the proud attitude of a thing that thought it had found a clever way around a bad law. No one was in it. The hood was cool. He stood a long time and looked at the way the tires had churned and then smoothed and then stopped. He took out his phone, knowing full well it would say no service, and it did, as if it felt the absurdity, and decided to lean into it. He laughed once, not because any of this was funny, but because breath needed a shape. The lawyer in Fairmont, Harlan Pike, had offered him coffee and a napkin when they first met a week ago, and James had taken both. Harlan had the kind of voice that made people stop wanting to argue, gentle but not soft. Silas was particular, he had said, tapping the folder. He paid on time and kept his papers tidy and never told me a thing unless it belonged on a form. But he smiled when he talked about the ridges, said, "They'll teach you if you shut up." I suppose that's in the will somewhere too. It hadn't been, not in so many words, but here in the timber the lesson hung in the air. James didn't intend to run at anything. He intended to learn it until it couldn't hide. The message came 2 days later, not by voice but as quiet as a groundhog. He had spent the morning splitting rounds that Silas had left in a heap and stacking them in rows so the wind could run through, when Ghost left his shady patch and trotted to the door, gave one low sound, and sat. On the door, held under the hammered point of a knife stuck a finger deep into oak, was a paper. It wasn't a note. It was a photograph, an old one clipped from a farm auction flyer, the kind they tacked to the bulletin board at the elevator, with his old address circled in red grease pencil and the words "Absolute Auction" across the top like a slap. The date was 3 years back. The edges were soft from handling. He did not touch it at first. He looked at the knife. Hardware store brand, the $6 kind men bought when they forgot theirs. He pulled it free, folded the paper once, and put both on the table. Ghost leaned into his knee and looked up with that kind of attention that made a man feel like his better self was present and taking notes. "All right," James said finally. "They know who I was. We'll teach them who I am. There are people who answer a threat with a bigger threat, and people who answer with patience." James was of the second sort, partly by nature, and partly because life had taught him that good fences last longer than loud voices. He sat with his coffee and thought not about men, but about routes and habits. He drew the old logging grade as he'd seen it on Silas's map and on the hill, and marked where it crossed little runs and where a truck would slow if it had to. Not because he wanted to be waiting there with a gun, but because that's where a camera could watch without seeing more than it should. He found Silas's trail cameras in a box, cleaned their contacts, put in fresh cards from the cigar tin, and walked out before dusk to set them where beech and hemlock could break lines and keep lens glint off. He measured by stride and eye, 70 paces from the corner post, 10 from the laurel patch, and he talked to Ghost the whole time like they were planning a fence. That night the first flurries came, early like a joke, and then the real weather rose behind them, a wall of white that swallowed sound. Snow in these hills came sidewise and then fell straight, and when it did, all the shapes turned into new shapes, and men who didn't belong learned how easily the land forgot their names. James set water jugs along the wall, filled the big enamel basin, checked the stovepipe for draw, and put a dish of drippings out on the porch post for whatever needed fat bad enough to come near. He tied a length of bell wire from the south fence to a nail on the window frame. It wasn't a trap. It was a way of letting wood and wire and wind convene in his ear if something tugged. He rolled around bale with the tractor to sit like a barrel where it could break any straight shot line to the door, and he stacked 3 feed sacks full of sand he'd shoveled from the creek bend along the base of the window that faced the grade. Not because he wanted a fort, but because a bag of sand had more uses than bravado did. When the storm found them, it found them ready. The sound of it under the eaves was like wheat under rain when it first opens, and then like corn leaves slapping, and then like nothing he had a field word for. Ghost stood at the window for a long time, and then lay where he could see both the door and James's hands. The radio hissed and then cut clean and then hissed again. He turned the volume down and let it be what it could be. He ate cold beans and laughed because hunger did not care if food was poetic, and he put a scrap on the floor for Ghost, who took it with the care of a creature who understood rationing as religion. Movement on snow is its own language. Even at night, even in wind, the world shifts different when it carries something that thinks like you do. The bell wire plucked once so gently he could have sworn he imagined it, and he looked at Ghost, who was already looking at the wire, and then at him, ears forward, and then the wire plucked again, just a kiss. James slid to the side of the window where his shadow wouldn't write itself on the snow, and lifted the night glass. The world bloomed, green, grainy, bright in the ways that mattered. And he saw two figures materialize at the edge of the clearing, one low, one taller, moving like men who had learned to trust their feet. They didn't rush. They let the wind cover them, and then just stood, looking at the house like it had looked at them first. One lifted a hand, and he saw the glint of something long on his back, and the other put a palm flat on the fence rail and held it there as if a man could read a property line through his skin. They moved left together, not toward the door, but toward the tower, and there James felt the heat rise under his breastbone in a way that was not anger, but something close to it. It wasn't a monument, that tower. It was a thinking place. He didn't want their hands on it. He didn't take down the rifle. He took the flashlight and the roll of welding flux Silas had left, and the long-handled lighter, and stepped onto the porch and set the can down in a place he'd chosen in his mind earlier, where the wind would grab the smoke and push it away from the door and toward the men. And he struck the lighter and fed it in and stepped back into the door's dark. The can coughed, and then a gout of bright white smoke rushed out, urgent and thick. And the wind hurled it low, and the world inside his binoculars went milk, and the men who had been shadows became silhouettes, coughing and cursing unhandsome. Ghost did not bark. James let the door stand half-closed and spoke into the radio in the voice of a man reading a rain gauge. Ranger station, traffic on foot at south fence in storm, not engaging, marking time and movement, over. The radio spat, and then a voice, maybe the same older one, said, "Copy, citizen. You sit tight." It sounded like a blessing that had promises inside it. The rest of the night came in pushes. They tried the door once, not with a shoulder, but with a pry that James could hear in the wood as a careful complaint, and when the door did not sing, they moved away. They put a shot into the window once, a mean little pop that webbed the thick glass but did not break it, and the bags of sand wore the thud like a memory. He aimed the rifle once, not to fire, but to let the man on the other side of the glass feel what it meant to be held in a crosshair. It was a cruel tool, that feeling, and he set the rifle down after the man retreated, not because he felt sorry for him. He did and didn't, both at once, but because he didn't want to like that power. Dawn came the way it comes in hills, grey first, then blue, and then a switch thrown somewhere behind the ridge that made the first brown leaf leap out of a snowbank like a small miracle. The storm's back broke like a wave. Sound returned. A pileated woodpecker across the hollow started his hammer's talk like a foreman announcing a shift. James stepped onto the porch, and the snow squeaked under his boot. 3 men were in the yard, in the attitudes of the night's work. A dropped crowbar, a scarf frozen in a knot on a fence post, a footprint that showed a toe worn down on the left. He didn't chase or follow. He took pictures with Silas's old camera, because sometimes old things worked when new ones didn't. He went to the tower and put his palm on the lowest brace, like a man greeting a friend who had been worried for him. He checked the trail cameras and brought their cards in and set water to boil and put his hand on Ghost's head for a long time, thumb rubbing the crease where the ear met the skull, and Ghost returned his gaze with the warm, ordinary miracle of a dog's trust. The helicopter didn't come that day because mountains make rules about flying and men obey them or bury their friends. What came instead around mid-morning was the grind of tracks and the voices of men calling to one another like they were in a hayfield. And then 3 snowmobiles pulled into the clearing, led by a ranger with a face like a shovel. Square, useful, clean. He took in the door, the sandbags, the smoke-blackened can, the bell wire tied to the window nail, the dog's steady stance, the man's eyes, and he nodded in the way men do when they can work with what they see. "You must be James," he said, and held out a hand. "Name's Hollis. We got your calls. You did right." The way he said it took the last of the night's shiver out of James's shoulders. "I just watched," James said. "I didn't want to be more than that." Hollis looked past him at the tower, then at the ridge. "Sometimes that's exactly enough." They made a small camp in the clearing's edge and took statements in notebooks that looked a lot like Silas's. They collected the crowbar and scarf and cast a footprint with plaster from a kit that had its own place in a ranger's sled. One of them took the trail camera cards and slid them into a little rugged viewer and whistled low. "Look here," he said, turning the screen, and there were faces captured at the edge of a headlight wash. There were license frames and stickers and the sag of a truck under something heavy, and there was the old tram grade with new tracks biting the frozen ruts. Hollis didn't smile, but the set of his jaw loosened a hair. "It's the 3rd time this month we've had rumours down this side of Monongahela," he said, scratching a little map with a stick in the snow and then wiping it out. "You gave us more than we had, and that matters." When they left the clearing quieter than they found it. James stacked the sandbags against the wall, not because he thought he wouldn't need them again, but because leaving them out felt like an invitation to make more nights like last night. He took the knife hole in the door down, with a sliver and a plug and a little stain. He mended the fence rail where a hand had pressed, and he taped the cracked inner pane of the window in a tidy cross until he could find a proper replacement. After, he sat on the stoop with Ghost leaning heavy against his leg, and the sun came out as if the day had been holding its breath too. The snow on the hemlock boughs slid off in quiet avalanches, and the drip from the eaves found the rain barrel lids and made a music he had missed since the last good spring. He thought of fields that had taught him both poverty and bounty, of auctions where men slapped his back and meant well and meant nothing, of a house that had been emptied in an hour into a trailer bound for strangers. He thought of Silas's careful letters and the star cut from brass, and of the way a man could build a lock just to make sure the key went to the right hands. He did not kid himself that what had passed was done. Men who hauled at night learned patience the way riverstones learned smoothness. He knew there would be other nights, and that the law moved in a line that curved with the weight it carried. But he also knew something had shifted. He had not been a man standing in a road with his palms up before a machine too big to argue with. He had been the kind of man his grandfather had been when he calculated the grade of a terrace by the way water pooled on a spade and made a mark in the field with a toe of his boot and then ran a level line. Quiet, steady, exact. A steward, not a saviour. By late afternoon, he had a pot of stew going that would taste better tomorrow, and a list in the margin of the night's notebook that wasn't about other men at all. Plant a line of red osier dogwood along the wet footpath so spring melt had a place to hold and bleed slow. Cut a fire break wider on the south slope where the hemlock duff was deep and sullen. Move the bluebird houses up out of the line of the clearing. Set a cistern lid tighter against raccoons and weather. Ghost snored softly, legs twitching in a run he'd never admit to, and the kettle sang a little. James went to the sink and drew a cup of cold water and drank it and tasted iron and rock and distance and something like home. That night, before he slept, he climbed the tower one more time with the brass disc in his pocket and the radio on his belt. The stars were out between tatters of cloud, the kind of night where the cold bit and then you forgot because you were busy looking. He set the disc on the shelf and found the shape in the sky that echoed it, a scatter he'd never named before because no one had told him the word, and he decided it didn't matter. Names were for people. The sky had its work, whether or not a man labelled it. He checked the grade with the night glass, and saw nothing but the white, broken field of the storm's aftermath and the gentle, slow walk of a deer. He said aloud, to the dark room and the man who'd built it, "I'll keep it straight," and felt a foolishness, and then didn't. He locked the chest, pressed the little carved star back flush in the wood, and climbed down into a world that did not owe him anything, and that he would love anyway. In the morning, he would write a letter to Harlan Pike on the lined paper he'd found in the drawer, with a pencil sharpened so the point sang when it touched, and he would say thank you for the trust, and please send me copies of any papers I should file to keep taxes tidy, and I will be a good man on this land. He would drive to town when the road allowed, and buy window glazing and a bag of feed, and a roll of woven wire, and a handful of brass screws that would outlast his hands, and he would listen to the men at the counter talk about deer numbers and school board decisions, and the storm that came early. And he would say little and learn much. He would come home and set his boots on the mat, and shake the snow from his hat, and scratch Ghost behind the ear, and step into a room that held warmth because he had put it there. The Watchtower would keep watching, and the creeks would rise and fall on the sticks he set, and the wind would find the dogwood stems when their red bark woke in winter. And men moving in the dark would learn there was a man here now who was not trying to be a sheriff, only a witness, and that might be enough to change where they chose to stand. And if it wasn't, he would be ready in the ways that didn't make noise. He would mend. He would measure. He would plant. He would keep straight fences and honest books and a kettle almost ready, because strangers sometimes came out of storms, and sometimes they were rangers, and sometimes they were just men tired of doing a thing the wrong way, who needed a quiet place to stop. He lay down, and Ghost's weight settled heavy against the side of the bed, like a wall that breathed. Snow slipped from the roof in a long, soft hush. Somewhere in the distance, an owl asked its same old question, and did not wait for an answer, because the asking was the work. The stove ticked as it gave up a little of its heat to the room. James closed his eyes and felt the odd, bright ache of a beginning that comes after endings. A soreness like the day after a first good day's work. He did not think of auctions or bankers. He thought of fence pliers and seeds and star-shaped keys, and of a man he had not met who had known him anyway. He let the dark take him in, not as a hiding place, but as a field at night where you knew the rows by feel, and where in the morning you rose and went back out, because that is what you do when land trusts you with its name.